I came home that evening with a sense of relief, ready to sink into the comfort of my routine with Emily. Work had been relentless. Nothing but long hours spent tracking down leads on a case that had consumed my team for months. There was a dangerous man out there, slipping through our fingers each time we thought we had him. But tonight, I didn't want to think about him. Tonight, I wanted to forget everything, fall into bed with my wife, and feel normal for a few hours. Except when I walked through the door, I could tell something was off. Emily greeted me with her usual smile, but it felt forced. I had grown to know her tells over the years. How her lips tightened when she was holding something back. How her eyes darted away from mine for a split second longer than usual. It was subtle, but I noticed. I always notice. She asked about my day, the way she always did, but there was no warmth in her voice. I brushed it off at first. It had been a long week, and maybe she was just tired. But as we moved through the motions of our evening, dinner, a half-hearted conversation about the kids, a few minutes of TV before she excused herself to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Later that night, lying next to her in bed, I stared at the ceiling, listening to her shallow breathing. She had turned away from me, her body curled into a ball, facing the wall. Normally, she'd press her back against me, and I'd drape an arm over her waist, pulling her close. Tonight, there was a chasm between us, one I didn't know how to cross. My mind wandered back to work, back to the case, and I couldn't help but see the parallels. I'd spent months trying to connect dots, to figure out who was betraying whom, and why. I'd sifted through clues, analyzed every detail, searching for a pattern. And now, lying next to my wife, I realized I had missed the signs in my own home. It wasn't just tonight. Emily had been distant for weeks, maybe even months. She was on her phone more than usual, quick to put it away when I walked into the room. She'd started going out more, claiming she needed me time, or that she was meeting up with friends. At first, I believed her. Why wouldn't I? But now, as I replayed all those moments in my mind, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in my gut. I turned my head to look at her. Her phone was on the nightstand, face down, as usual. I resisted the urge to grab it and see what was on it. I'd never invaded her privacy before, but this was different. Something was happening, something I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I left for work early, trying to focus on the case, but Emily was all I could think about. Every moment we'd shared over the past few weeks felt tainted now, and I hated myself for even thinking that way. I was a cop, trained to detect lies, but I never thought I'd need those skills in my own marriage. By the afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, and I knew how to get them. I called in a favor with a tech guy I knew from work. Nothing official, just a discreet request. He set me up with a simple tracking app, something that could be installed on her phone without her knowing. It wasn't legal, and I knew it crossed a line, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know. That night, after Emily had fallen asleep, I slipped her phone off the nightstand and took it into the bathroom. My hands were steady as I installed the app, my mind buzzing with adrenaline. I hated myself for doing this, but at the same time, I felt like I didn't have a choice. I had to protect myself, protect our family. If there was nothing going on, I'd never mention it. But if there was, I slipped the phone back onto her nightstand and climbed into bed. I didn't sleep much that night. I spent most of it staring at the ceiling, wondering what the hell I'd done, and whether or not I really wanted to know the truth. The next day, the app pinged for the first time while I was at work. She wasn't where she said she'd be. Emily had told me she was meeting her friend for coffee in town, but her location showed she was somewhere else entirely, an unfamiliar address on the outskirts of the city. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe her friend had moved, or maybe they were just grabbing a coffee somewhere out of the way. But the gnawing suspicion wouldn't leave me. I looked up the address later that day and found nothing at first. It was just a house, nothing remarkable about it. But something about it stuck with me, and I kept digging, pulling up property records and cross-referencing names. And that's when I saw it. The house belonged to a man named Jacob Stone. The name was familiar, but it took me a minute to place it. When I did, it was like a punch to the gut. Jacob Stone was a known associate of the man my team had been investigating for months. A man who was one of the most dangerous criminals in the city, someone we had been trying to take down for years. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just some random guy. This was someone tied to the case I was working on. And my wife was at his house. I didn't want to believe it. It was too much of a coincidence, too surreal. But the more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fit together. Her late nights out, the secretive phone calls, the distance between us. It all made sense now. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was involved with someone dangerous, someone connected to the man I'd been chasing. I spent the next few days in a daze, going through the motions at work, pretending like everything was fine. But inside, I was falling apart. I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more proof. I needed to be sure. So I kept watching, kept tracking her movements. And each time, it led back to the same place. Back to him. One night, after she had gone to bed, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled up the app and started going through her messages. Most of them were innocent, text with friends, family, the usual stuff. But then I found a string of texts from a number I didn't recognize. The messages were casual at first, but they quickly became more personal, more intimate. It didn't take long to figure out who the number belonged to. Jacob. The texts made me sick to my stomach. They were full of inside jokes, flirtations, things that I hadn't seen from her in months. And then there were the plans, the times and places they'd meet, the lies she'd told me so she could see him. I wanted to smash the phone, to throw it across the room, but I held back. I couldn't afford to lose control. Not yet. I started digging deeper, looking for anything I could use to confirm what I already knew. And that's when I found it. A photo. It was blurry, taken from a distance, but I recognized the place. It was the same house she had been going to, the one that belonged to Jacob. In the photo, she was standing by the door, smiling. And Jacob was with her, his hand on her waist. That was it. That was all the proof I needed. I sat there, staring at the photo, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Confronting her now wouldn't just be about the affair. This was bigger than that. She was involved with a man tied to the criminal I'd been after for months. A man who could ruin everything if he found out who I was. I needed to play this smart. I needed to stay calm. For the next few days, I acted like nothing had changed. I kissed her goodbye in the mornings, made small talk over dinner, and pretended that everything was normal. But inside, I was planning. I was waiting for the right moment. And then it came. A few days later, I got a tip at work. We had a lead on the man we'd been chasing, and it was a good one. A meeting was going down, something big, and Jacob was going to be there. I knew what I had to do. That night, as Emily slept beside me, I made the call. The team was ready, and we had everything we needed to move in. All I had to do was wait. The next day, Emily left the house as usual, telling me she was meeting a friend. I kissed her on the cheek, told her I loved her, and watched her drive away. As soon as she was gone, I followed. The meeting was happening at Jacob's house, the same place Emily had been going for weeks. I parked a few blocks away, watching as she pulled into the driveway, her car disappearing into the garage. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, until I saw the van pull up. My team was in position, ready to move in. I stayed in the car as they stormed the house, watching from a distance as everything unfolded. Emily had no idea what was happening, no idea that her world was about to come crashing down. It was over in minutes. Jacob was in cuffs and Emily was sitting on the front steps, her face pale, her hands trembling. I got out of the car and walked towards her, my heart heavy with a mixture of anger and sorrow. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "Mark, what's going on?" I stared at her, my throat tight with emotion. "You lied to me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You've been lying to me for months." Tears filled her eyes, and she shook her head. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean." "You didn't mean to what?" I cut her off, my anger boiling over. "You didn't mean to cheat on me? You didn't mean to get involved with a man who's been running from the law? You didn't mean to put our family at risk?" She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't give her the chance. I turned and walked away, my heart shattering with every step. It was over. All of it. Our marriage, the life we had built together. It was all gone. And there was no going back. I got in the car and drove, my mind swirling with the images of Emily on that porch, pale and trembling, her life in pieces just like mine. But even as I sped down the empty streets, something gnawed at me, a sense that this was far from over. Jacob had been taken down, yes, but it felt too easy. The way Emily looked at me, like she wasn't just afraid of being caught but afraid of something else, something bigger. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had missed something, something critical. I spent the next few days going through the motions at work, filing reports, attending briefings, and pretending everything was under control. But in reality, I was far from okay. The house was quiet when I came home, too quiet. Emily hadn't come back. After the raid, she had been taken in for questioning, and I had stayed as far away from her as I could. I wanted to confront her, to scream and demand to know why she had done this, why she had betrayed me. But part of me was terrified of what she might say. The case wasn't closed yet. The man we had been after, the real target of the investigation, Stone's boss, was still out there. And with every piece of intel we gathered, I realized just how deep the rabbit hole went. Then one night, my phone buzzed. A text message from a number I didn't recognize. "You think it's over, but it's just beginning." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. The message was cryptic, but the meaning was clear. Someone knew. Someone was still watching. I didn't respond, but I saved the number, feeling a chill run down my spine. I didn't tell my team about the message. Something told me this was personal now. The next day, as I was driving to the station, my phone buzzed again. Another message. "Check the attic." I nearly swerved off the road, glancing at the phone like it had come alive. The attic? My mind raced. I hadn't been up there in years. What the hell was going on? I drove straight home, not even bothering to take off my jacket as I headed straight for the attic door. Dusty and forgotten, it was a place I barely thought about, full of old boxes and memories we never touched. But as I pulled the ladder down and climbed into the musty space, I had a sinking feeling that I was about to uncover something that would change everything. At first, it looked like nothing was out of the ordinary. Just boxes of old Christmas decorations, some of Emily's childhood things, and a few pieces of furniture we'd shoved up there when we first moved in. But then, tucked behind a row of boxes, I saw it. A small black bag, wedged between the rafters, hidden away like it didn't belong. I reached for it, my hands trembling. The bag was heavy, and as I unzipped it, my heart pounded in my chest. Inside was a laptop, sleek and modern, not like anything we owned. And underneath it, a stack of envelopes, each one marked with a single name, Emily's. I pulled out the laptop first, booting it up. No password screen. It opened straight into a desktop, cluttered with folders and documents. My hands shook as I clicked through them, not knowing what I was expecting to find. Financial records, emails, messages, all encrypted. But the few I could open showed transactions. Large sums of money being moved around, accounts in foreign countries, and names I recognized from my investigation. Jacob Stone was just the tip of the iceberg. But this wasn't just his operation. Emily was connected to it. Her name appeared in too many places for it to be a coincidence. What the hell had she gotten herself into? Then I found the folder labeled simply, Watch. I clicked it, and the screen filled with videos. Surveillance footage. Of me. Of my house. Of us. From months ago. Clips of Emily and I in the kitchen, the living room, even the bedroom. It wasn't just a few moments here and there. This was continuous, 24/7 surveillance of our entire life. I felt sick. How long had this been going on? Who was watching us? I slammed the laptop shut, my heart racing. I ripped open the envelopes, expecting more of the same, but what I found was worse. Inside were photos of Emily with other men. Not just Jacob, there were others, men I didn't recognize. Some of them looked dangerous, men with scars and tattoos that screamed, criminal. And then, among the stack of photos, I found a single image that sent chills down my spine. It was of me, with a red circle around my face. Beneath the photo was a note, hastily scribbled in ink. He knows too much. Deal with him. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. Emily hadn't just been having an affair. She had been using me. She had been feeding information about the investigation to these men, letting them stay one step ahead of us. And now that Jacob was in custody, I was a loose end. I staggered back, my mind reeling. Emily wasn't just involved. She was in deep, and now I was in danger. Before I could process it any further, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the same unknown number. Get out. Now. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the laptop, shoved it back into the bag, and ran down the stairs. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. Was Emily in on this, or was she being blackmailed? How deep did this conspiracy go? As I reached the front door, I heard a car pull into the driveway. My blood ran cold. I glanced through the window and saw a black sedan. The same sedan I had seen parked near our house months ago, the one that had triggered my suspicions in the first place. I ran to the back door, slipping out as quietly as I could. My car was parked a few blocks away, and I sprinted towards it, my heart pounding in my ears. Whoever was in that sedan wasn't here for a friendly chat. As I reached my car, I saw them. The two men from the sedan, dressed in black, moving towards the house. They didn't look like ordinary thugs. They moved with precision, like they knew exactly what they were doing. I got into the car, started the engine, and peeled out of the neighborhood, my mind racing. I couldn't go back home. I couldn't trust anyone. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to piece together what had just happened. Emily had been playing me from the start. She wasn't just having an affair. She was involved in something far more dangerous. And now I was caught in the middle of it. Eventually, I pulled into a motel on the outskirts of the city. I needed time to think, to figure out my next move. I took the laptop out of the bag and opened it again, scrolling through the files. There had to be something here, something that could explain why Emily had gotten involved in this mess. And then I found it. A video file, buried deep in the encrypted folders. I clicked on it, and the screen flickered to life. It was footage of Emily. She was sitting in a dimly lit room, her hands folded in her lap. Across from her was a man I didn't recognize, a tall, imposing figure with a cold expression. He was asking her questions, but his voice was low, almost a whisper. I leaned closer, trying to make out what they were saying. "You know what happens if you don't comply," the man said, his voice like ice. "Your family, your husband, they'll all pay the price." Emily looked terrified. She nodded, her eyes darting around the room. "I don't want them to get hurt," she whispered. "I'll do whatever you ask. Just don't hurt them." My heart clenched. Emily hadn't been doing this willingly. She had been coerced, blackmailed into feeding information to these men. And now, it was all coming to a head. I watched as the man handed her a file, my file. "This is your next target," he said. "Make sure he doesn't make it out alive." The video cut off. I sat there in stunned silence, my mind racing. Emily had been forced into this, but now she was in too deep. And I was the target. I was the loose end they needed to tie up. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't just run. I had to take them down. All of them. Starting with the man in the video. I packed up the laptop and headed out into the night. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival. I drove through the night, every nerve on edge, replaying the video in my mind. The image of Emily, terrified and desperate, haunted me. She'd been caught in this web for God knows how long, and I hadn't seen it. Or maybe I hadn't wanted to. But now, it was all laid out in front of me. The men who had blackmailed her, who had coerced her into betraying me, her own husband, were still out there, and they wanted me dead. And from the looks of it, they weren't going to stop until I was 6 feet under. I couldn't call the station. There was no telling how far this thing reached, how many people had been compromised. There had to be others involved, cops, maybe even higher-ups. I couldn't trust anyone, not yet. I found a rest stop and pulled over, shutting off the engine. The cool night air hit me as I stepped out of the car, and for the first time in hours, I took a breath. I needed a plan. Something solid, something that would keep me alive and take these guys down at the same time. The key was in the laptop. I had barely scratched the surface of what was on there, and I knew there had to be more. The financial records, the emails, the encrypted files, it was all connected. But the laptop wasn't enough. I needed to get closer, to know who the man in the video was and how deep this operation went. I scrolled through the files again, my fingers hovering over the keys, trying to find anything that could help me. Then I found it, a folder labeled Contacts. Inside were dozens of names, addresses, and phone numbers. Some I recognized, some I didn't. But one name stood out to me like a beacon in the dark. Charles Harrington. Harrington was a ghost, a name whispered in back alleys and dark rooms. He was the one pulling the strings behind so many operations I had investigated but never gotten close to. We had suspected him for years, but no one had ever been able to tie him directly to anything. He was careful, operating in the shadows, letting others do the dirty work for him. But now I had his address. This was it. This was my shot. I slammed the laptop shut and got back in the car, my heart pounding in my chest. I drove without thinking. The address burned into my brain. Harrington wasn't going to get away this time. I was going to confront him, and I was going to make him pay for everything. What he did to me, to Emily, to countless others whose lives he had destroyed. I arrived at the address just as dawn was breaking. The house was huge, tucked away in the hills outside the city, surrounded by high walls and security cameras. It looked like a fortress, and for good reason. Harrington had enemies, lots of them, but I didn't care. I had one goal in mind: get inside and confront the man behind it all. I parked the car down the road, far enough away that it wouldn't raise suspicion, and made my way through the trees, sticking to the shadows. As I approached the house, I spotted a gap in the wall where the cameras couldn't reach. I slipped through, keeping low, and made my way to the back door. Breaking in was easy. The security was top-notch, but I had picked up a few tricks over the years, and within minutes, I was inside. The house was eerily quiet. I moved through the hallways like a ghost, my heart racing as I approached what looked like an office at the far end of the house. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear voices inside. Harrington's voice, calm and measured, and someone else's, pleading, desperate. I pushed the door open, my hand resting on the gun at my hip, ready for whatever was on the other side. Harrington was sitting behind a large desk, his back to me. Across from him, kneeling on the floor, was Emily. My breath caught in my throat. Her wrists were bound, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, and I saw the fear I'd seen in the video. The fear that she was trapped, that this was all out of her control. Harrington turned slowly, his lips curling into a cold smile when he saw me. "Well, well," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I was wondering when you'd show up." I didn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Emily, bound and helpless. Harrington, calm as if this were all part of some sick game. "What the hell is this?" I growled, my hand tightening around the grip of my gun. Harrington leaned back in his chair, unbothered by my presence. "You're a detective. You tell me." Emily let out a sob, her shoulders shaking. "Mark, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't have a choice." I took a step forward, my gun still trained on Harrington. "Let her go," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Now." Harrington laughed softly, shaking his head. "You really don't get it, do you? She's been working for me from the start. Everything you think you know, everything you've pieced together, it's all part of the plan." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. "No," I said, shaking my head. "She wouldn't do that. She wouldn't betray you?" Harrington interrupted, his smile widening. "She already has. Multiple times. The affair, the lies, the surveillance. She's been feeding me information for months. And you, Mark, you were just the perfect pawn." I stared at him, my mind reeling. This couldn't be true. Emily was scared. I could see that. She was being forced into this, just like the video had shown. But then Emily spoke, her voice trembling. "It's true, Mark," she said, her eyes filled with tears. "At first, I didn't have a choice. He threatened me, threatened you. But after a while, I didn't know how to get out. I didn't know how to stop. I felt my world crumbling around me. Every ounce of trust one had left was shattered in that moment." Emily had been involved from the beginning. She hadn't just been coerced. She had gone along with it, at least for a while. Harrington stood up, circling the desk slowly. "The thing is, detective," he said, his voice smooth and mocking, "you're good. You've been getting too close for comfort. That's why I had to bring you in, make you a part of this." I tightened my grip on the gun. You used her, I said, my voice shaking with rage. You used her to get to me. Harrington shrugged. I use everyone. That's how this works. But now, he trailed off, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small device. Now, you're going to make a choice. I tensed as he held up the device, a small detonator, the kind used for explosives. My heart pounded in my chest. What the hell is that? Harrington's smile widened. Insurance. You see, you're going to let me walk out of here, and you're going to let Emily walk too. Or, I blow the whole place sky high. You, her, everyone in this house. You all go down together. I glanced at Emily, her eyes wide with terror. This was it. This was the final twist, the final game Harrington was playing. He had me right where he wanted me. But what he didn't know was that I had come prepared. I had slipped a small bug into his security system earlier, something the tech guy had given me as a parting gift when I left the force. It was simple but effective, and right now, it was my only shot. I lowered the gun slowly, making it seem like I was giving in. Harrington's smile grew wider. Smart man, he said, taking a step forward. Now, just... The sound of glass shattering filled the room, and before Harrington could react, the windows exploded inward as a SWAT team stormed the room. Harrington's eyes widened in shock, and he raised the detonator, but I was faster. I fired once, hitting him square in the chest. He stumbled backward, the detonator falling from his hand as he crashed to the floor. The SWAT team moved in quickly, securing the room and freeing Emily from her bindings. She collapsed into my arms, sobbing, and I held her tightly, my heart still racing. Harrington lay motionless on the floor, his reign of terror finally over. But as I held Emily, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. I had lost her, maybe not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. The trust was gone, shattered beyond repair. She had been a pawn in Harrington's game, but she had also made her choices. And I didn't know if I could ever forgive her for that. As the team cleared the room, I stood there, holding her, feeling the weight of everything that had happened crash down on me. Revenge had been served, but the cost had been far greater than I could have ever imagined. I stood there, holding Emily in my arms, but it felt like I was holding a stranger. Her body trembled against mine, the sobs racking through her, but the connection we once had was gone, dissolved in a sea of betrayal, lies, and manipulation. She had been a pawn, yes, but she had also played me. And that was something I wasn't sure I could ever come back from. The SWAT team moved methodically around us, securing the house, checking Harrington's lifeless body for any last tricks. One of them came over and gave me a nod. It's over, sir, he said, his voice muffled behind his helmet. We've got everything under control. Over. The word echoed in my head. This nightmare, this betrayal, this twisted mess of my personal and professional life, it was finally over. But somehow, I didn't feel the relief I had expected. I felt hollow, like everything I had fought for had slipped through my fingers. I pulled away from Emily, gently but firmly. She looked up at me with tear-streaked eyes, her lips trembling, as if she was about to say something. But I couldn't bear to hear it. Not now. Maybe not ever. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, Mark, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos around us. I never wanted to hurt you. I was scared, and I didn't know how to stop. I met her gaze, feeling the weight of everything that had happened crash over me like a tidal wave. She wasn't the woman I thought she was. Or maybe she was, and I had just been blind to it all. It didn't matter now. Nothing she could say would undo the damage. You should have told me, I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. You should have come to me. We could have figured this out together. She nodded, her face crumpling with guilt and regret. I know. I was just so deep. I didn't know how to get out. I stared at her, wanting to feel anger, wanting to feel something other than this crushing sense of loss. But all I felt was exhaustion. I was tired of the lies, tired of the chase, tired of pretending that everything could go back to the way it was. It's too late, I said, taking a step back. Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. No, Mark, please, she begged, reaching for me, but I stepped out of her reach. Please, we can fix this. I'll do anything. Anything to make it right. I shook my head. It's over, Emily. We're over. Her face fell, and for a moment, I saw the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. The woman who had once been my everything. But that woman was gone now, lost in the lies and betrayal that had unraveled between us. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell her I forgave her. I wanted to believe that we could somehow find our way back to each other. But deep down, I knew the truth. Some betrayals cut too deep. Some wounds never heal. I turned away, leaving her standing there in the wreckage of our lives. The SWAT team moved around me as I walked out of the house, their voices fading into the background as I stepped into the cool morning air. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the horizon, but it felt like the dawn of a world I no longer recognized. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the silence, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Harrington was dead. The man behind it all, the man who had turned my life upside down, was gone. But in his wake, he had left destruction that no amount of justice could fix. As I walked to my car, I felt the weight of my gun on my hip, the same gun I had pulled on Harrington. I had expected revenge to feel different, satisfying, cathartic. But it hadn't. It had only left me feeling emptier than before. I drove aimlessly for hours, not knowing where to go, not knowing what to do. The streets passed by in a blur as my mind spiraled through every moment, every decision that had led to this point. The life I had built, the woman I had loved, the career I had dedicated myself to, it all felt like a lie. Eventually, I pulled over at a small park on the edge of the city. I got out of the car and sat down on a bench, staring out at the empty playground. A few early risers jogged by, unaware of the storm that had torn through my life in the past 48 hours. I thought about Emily, about the woman she had been, and the woman she had become. I thought about the life we had shared, the good and the bad, the love and the betrayal. I thought about the man I had been before all of this, and the man I was now. I wasn't the same. I could never be the same. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself cry. Silent tears slipped down my face, and I didn't wipe them away. I just sat there, letting the weight of everything sink in. The loss, the betrayal, the anger. It all crashed over me in waves, and for the first time, I let myself feel it. It would take time to rebuild. I knew that. Time to figure out who I was without her, without the life we had built together. But for now, all I could do was sit in the stillness and let the pieces of my life settle around me. I wasn't sure where I would go from here. The road ahead was uncertain, and the weight of the past hung heavy over me. But one thing was clear. This chapter of my life was over. And whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. In the end, there was no grand sense of victory. No triumphant moment where I could walk away feeling like I had won. I hadn't won. I had lost more than I ever thought possible. But in that loss, there was also a strange sense of clarity, a realization that sometimes the only way to move forward is to let go. As the sun rose higher in the sky, I stood up from the bench, wiped my face, and walked back to the car. There was no going back now, only forward. And wherever that road led, I knew I'd find a way to survive. And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below. Tell us, what would you have done in their shoes?